It was during the experience of the tension on campus about race one of the things I decided to do was to something concrete for the community, that is the black community. So I got my colleagues in the English department to donate books, and I got a car full of books of various kind. Obviously, most of them were about literature and the humanities, but I decided to take those down to a library in Watts, which is one of the traditional black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And I took my two of my kids, my older kids, Jenny and Bobby, with me. And even though I had lived part of my life on the margin of a black-white community, as I drove into Watts in the late afternoon, there was a certain point in which I realized that I was no longer that I'd moved from a white community to a black community, in which, as I looked around, there were no white faces. And I had this experience similar to what I had had in my classes teaching literature. I taught black literature for a while at UCLA in my classes. That's when a white guy could still teach black literature. But in those classes, it was the first time in studying James Baldwin and a number of black writers from the 19th and 20th century. It was the first time that I really understood what it was like to be a black person, although I had had that experience when I was in the Army, when I flew from Utah and then to Wyoming, and from Wyoming to my missionary companion and I joined the Army at the same time, and we had flown to Orlando, Florida, on our way to Fort Gordon, Georgia. And in Laramie, we picked up a black kid from Haiti who had joined the Army. When we got off of the plane in Orlando, we got on a bus to go to Fort Gordon, and sat down in the front of the bus, and the bus driver turned and saw us, and he came and said to our black friend, "You have to sit in the back of the bus." And I didn't really understand. I said, "Oh, there's a lot of room here." I moved over, and he again said patiently, "You'll have to sit in the back of the bus." And I thought, well, what in the world's in the back of the bus? And I turned and saw the color line, and I was shocked by that. As I was shocked in driving through the Georgia countryside and seeing signs that said, "Colored man, don't let the sun set on your head in this town," and seeing colored and white drinking fountains and swimming pools. And the Army was completely integrated. So my sergeant was black, and my fellow soldiers were, Hispanic and black and white. But it was just a shock to me to realize that in the United States of America, which I was a citizen, that these people were being treated this way. So I'd been very interested in the civil rights movement when I was at University of Wisconsin and later at UCLA. And so driving into Watts that night, that evening, I had a feeling of what it must be like for a black person to be in an all-white neighborhood. It was just a very dramatic kind of visceral sense of the power of racism. Anyway, we delivered the books, and that was part of my impulse to try and do something concrete, not just talk about it or not just write about it, this problem. So back at UCLA, I was, as I mentioned, involved in the arts. I was also working with Norman Cousins, who was a really important writer who had written a book called Anatomy of an Illness, and he was the former editor of the Saturday Review, and he had been working for years with exchanges with writers between the United States and the Soviet Union, and he had the idea that he wanted to have similar kinds of exchanges with writers from China. And so I was invited to work with Norman in bringing a group of Chinese writers to the United States. And so we brought a group of distinguished writers. I arranged for them to go to Disneyland and to go to Yosemite and to really see the West, but also for them to go to New Orleans and to Washington and Boston and New York. And then I wanted them to see cowboys and Indians, so I brought them to the Intermountain area in Utah. And then they came back to Los Angeles, and we had a wonderful conference there. They then invited us to bring a group of American writers to China. So twice in the 80s, we had Chinese writers coming to the United States, and I was privileged to help lead two groups of American writers to China. And these were, I mean, it was really a wonderful thing because I could invite anyone I wanted. And so people like Toni Morrison and Maxine Hong Kingston and Allen Ginsberg and Harrison Salisbury, just, you know, some of the really important writers of the United States, I was able to take to China. On the first trip, Ruth went with me, and it was 1982, and it was just kind of the first. We were the first real American delegation of writers, a delegation of American writers invited to China, and it was a terrific experience to be welcomed by the Chinese writers and to have conferences in different cities and to be able to go to the Great Wall and to the Ming Tombs and to Xi'an to see the Terracotta Warriors and to be traveling with American writers and some of whom knew China, like Maxine Hong Kingston, whose family was from China, and Gary Snyder, who had studied Chinese at Berkeley. And so this tremendously rich experience of bringing American writers to China, bringing Chinese writers to the United States. And it was just an absolutely lovely experience. The second trip to China, I took my boys, Maddie and Bobby, and we played football on the Great Wall, and we had a great time in all of the cities that we traveled in. Once we traveled from Beijing to Xi'an, I think, and went by train, and it was like spending 24 hours doing a National Geographic special as we were crossing all of this wonderful terrain. And in each of these cities that we stopped in, there were just wonderful things to see and do. And Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder were I felt particularly close to them. And so they sometimes invited me to go with them, just walking the streets of these Chinese cities. And they felt at home any place in the world, so it was really fun. And it was fun to be with writers who were writing about their experience. There was once where Gary, who had written poems about a cold mountain temple, he had actually translated some of those poems. And so when we went to Xi'an to Cold Mountain Temple, I believe that's where it is, he brought a copy of his book and he handed it to the priest there. And he said, this book has finally come home. And then he was writing a poem about that experience, and Allen Ginsberg was sitting on Maple Bridge writing a poem about what was happening. And then I wrote a poem about Gary and Allen writing poems about this experience. And then on the way home on the train, it was just one of those very rich experiences where literature and life came together, as I think they're really intended to make and give meaning. I mean, that's really what we're here for, is to find meaning and to make meaning. And so to have those writers, and I remember the Chinese writers coming to the United States and just being blown away by the experience. We went to Yosemite, and this one very austere Chinese writer stood in front of Bridal Veil Falls as the water came down and hit the stones and washed over him, and he just looked up to the sky and said, I think this must truly be what baptism feels like. And then there's a famous Chinese poem about a man who gets drunk who tries to embrace the moon in the Yellow River. And when we were in Yosemite, all these Chinese writers wanted to see how many riders it would take to embrace one of those giant sequoia trees. So there's all of those really beautiful experiences which showed that language and culture ultimately break down when people are human, when they are interested in one another, when they share vision, when they share affection, when they share their own experience with one another. So it was the Chinese experience still has lots of echoes in my life.